I was uncertain earlier at the first service whether or not to stand. They asked, stand if you met your spouse at Southwestern. Well, I was already a graduate. I'd been to seminary, was pastoring in Austin, Texas. A friend of mine who was also pastoring, but he in Oklahoma, also single, named Bill Norman. Some of you will remember Mr. Norman, his father, who was a speech teacher here. Bill called me up and said, you need to go to the Keene travel agency next time you're up there to visit your folks and meet the woman who manages the travel agency. Now, Bill was always prone to lead me out on limbs that he would then saw off. And so I didn't trust what he said. I said, well, you're single. Why don't you go meet her? No, she's your type. I said, okay. Next time I was up at Keene, went back to Austin, he called me, did you go meet her? I said, no, I didn't go meet. Well, go meet her. This happened 2 or 3 times. The last time he said to me, don't worry about it. I introduced her, and he named a common friend of ours. I introduced her to so-and-so, and he's going to ask her out. I said, he's going to ask her out? Maybe I will go meet her. So the next time I was in Keene, I went into the travel agency, and there she was in the front desk, and I saw her there, and I said, meet the man you're going to marry. And she said, where is he? I was a pastor. I said, I that speak unto thee am he. She said, Lord, increase my faith. Or something like that. So she was a student, I was not, so I stood. So I'd like to ask Anita to stand. I'm delighted to have her here with me today. She also is a graduate of Keene. So it really is a privilege for us to join you here at Southwestern once again. We count this in many ways as home and are always privileged to be back in this area. I have to tell you, the music has been absolutely outstanding. Just cannot thank you enough. It has truly enriched my soul. And I also have to tell you that we have a gathering of pastors, gathering of senior pastors from college and university churches in the North American Division that meets every year, end of January, beginning of February in San Diego. And your pastor, Michael Gibson, is an honored and esteemed and respected and loved part of that community. His colleagues love him. You are blessed. So I want to thank Michael for the privilege also of sharing the pulpit here at Loma Linda. Forgive me, this is a day of introductions, right? Everybody's been standing. I have to say it's a delight to have my sister and brother-in-law, Mary Ellen and James Weingardner, here today. I think you all may know them. It's a privilege to have them with us. There's a question that if you haven't asked, you should have. A question that whether you're a student or an alumni, whether you're beginning or close to ending, is a valuable question to ask. What are you doing here? It's a question that speaks to purpose, to vision, to mission. You might ask it in the first person, what am I doing here? The answer to that question will define much about what God has placed in your heart and where God is guiding in your life. It's important to answer that question with authenticity and truth, but also with clarity and purpose. It's not an easy question to answer. I asked it and didn't answer it so well just a few steps from this sanctuary. Back in the old Evans Hall, I was a student down at KAES. I don't know how I got out of class that day. I suppose I played hooky and snuck out. But I came up to Evans Hall and I stood at the back of the auditorium, kind of leaning back against the wall, because I had heard that day the speaker for chapel was going to be a player for the Dallas Cowboys. I was excited. So I got there and I stood back there and I watched and waited, and sure enough, they introduced him and he got up and began to hold forth. And I was disappointed. Disappointed because he was a backup. I'd heard his name, but didn't really know much about him. And so I stood back there at the back of that auditorium, and I must have been asking myself the question, what am I doing here? Don't even know him, going to get in trouble back at class. And so finally, partway into his speech, I ducked out the door and was back to school. What am I doing here? I answered it, I don't know, and no point in staying. After all, who has ever heard of Roger Staubach? I mean, he did go to 4 Super Bowls, winning 2. One of the few Heisman Trophy winners and MVPs of the Super Bowl. Second wealthiest football player ever to live. But what am I doing here? I need to go back to elementary school. It's a key question, and if you mess up the answer, it can be problematic. I told a story back at Loma Linda here just 3 weeks ago about Keene. It happened supposedly while I was a student here at Keene. Story made its way around campus of a kid over at Jefferson Academy in East Texas who had sneaked into the girls' dorm, and the word went out, there's a boy in the girls' dorm. And so the dean went searching. Down the hall, into the rooms, under the beds, behind the dresser, opening the closet. Where is he? And she finally came to the room where she suspected he might be. The girl there petrified when the dean walked in. Is he in here? And looking under the bed, behind the dresser, pulled open the closet door, and there he stood. Wide-eyed, terrified, petrified. And she pointed at him and asked him the question, what are you doing here? He stood there for a moment, petrified, and finally managed to say, well, everybody's got to be somewhere. Now, I told my family back in Loma Linda, I can't vouch for the veracity of that. I just know that story went around the college campus. I got an email that week from a woman who said, the story is true. That was my husband. He got kicked out, and he should have. What are you doing here? Well, everybody's got to be somewhere. It was also while I was here at Keene. I had the privilege of leading campus ministries one year, and I was looking for speakers. Somebody told me there's an assistant coach on the Cowboys who has a good witness, a good testimony for Christ. Maybe you could get him to come. And so I had enough gall, I guess, to dial the Cowboys number. A feminine voice answered the phone, Dallas Cowboys. And I asked for the coach by name, expecting that there would be red tape and other people for whom I would have to answer questions before I might get to the coach. Such was not the case. The next voice on the line said, Coach Ditka here. And I thought, I'm talking to Mike Ditka, Iron Mike. And I stumbled my way through what I was wanting to ask him, at the end of which he said, sure, I'll come. I said, well, we don't have a lot of money. How much? He said, that's not the important thing. I'll be happy to come. And so he came. He came, and I sat next to him over in Evans Hall as he showed the Dallas Cowboys highlight reel from the year before, shook my hand, huge hands like shaking a leg. And we sat there and we watched that. He got up front, told stories. We were drawn in, captured. One of the stories he told was about being at training camp. He said, at training camp, we have curfew for the players. And we march the hallways, we coaches, to make sure they're tucked in and don't go anywhere. And he says, and one night, I'm walking the hallway, come around a corner, almost ran smack into a player. He was dressed to the nines, but had his shoes off, held them in his hand, on stocking feet, tiptoeing down the hall. I can't imagine anyone I would less want to encounter in that situation than Iron Mike Ditka. He came around the corner, and I saw him, and he stopped and looked at me, and we just stared at each other. And then I said to him the question, what are you doing here? He looked at me, fear in his eyes, and he said, Coach, I dropped my wallet out in the parking lot. I was going to go look for it. So I looked at him and said, what are you going to do, sneak up on it? Get back to your room. What are you doing here? Well, everybody's got to be somewhere. So I'm going to sneak out to where the real action is. I even thought about the question on a talk show I was listening to on the radio a number of years ago. The talk show host, who was very, very flamboyant, loudmouth sort, had told his listeners, if one of you calls in and gives me a compelling dream as to where you want to go live, I'll give you, and he named an amount, $5,000, $10,000, whatever it was, to start your fund to be able to move to that place. So I'm going to give that to the person who has the greatest dream, the greatest vision. And so we listened to different ones calling in. I was riding in the car with a friend of mine, and we're thinking, the beautiful, lush beaches of Hawaii or the beautiful mountaintops of Colorado, and this woman calls in. She says, I've had a dream all my life of moving out of downtown LA, and I'm thinking, yeah, I can understand that. And so he says, okay, well, this may be the one. Where do you want to move? She said, Burbank. Burbank. Now, if you're in downtown LA and you want to go to Burbank, get in your car, get on the 5 freeway, and depending on how big the traffic jam is that day, spend the next 30, 40 minutes, hour going 10 miles up the road to Burbank. And the talk show host just went off, hung up on her and said, this is crazy. Somebody has a dream anywhere, and they want to move. I don't have anything against Burbank, but from LA to Burbank? We got a problem of vision. What are you doing here? It's a question about purpose. I'm here because everybody's got to be somewhere. I don't know. I'm trying to sneak out of here without too much of it affecting me and get out to where real life is out in Burbank. Sometimes we have a real issue with purpose and with vision. It almost seems like we're like the cartoon that was sent to me, man in a faculty meeting who is dozing off. And underneath the caption said, when I die, I hope it's in a faculty meeting because the transition will be so subtle. Maybe that's what you're going through. Maybe you're in a class like that. Maybe you've gone through many business meetings like that. There's nothing going on here. I don't have any purpose. What am I doing here? That's the question God asked Elijah. What are you doing here? It's a question that went straight to the core of Elijah's life and vision and mission and purpose. You remember Elijah, that blood and guts prophet in ancient Israel who burst onto the center stage of Israel's history. Many personages in Scripture are introduced in a range of ways. Their genealogy is given, their tribe is given, their town is given, the context in which they lived is given. Not so with Elijah. Elijah is introduced with one word in 1 Kings 17:1. It simply says, now Elijah. Boom, center stage. In front of King Ahab, telling him, we're going to play show and tell, and then I'm going to go play hide and seek because it's not going to rain until I say so. And he disappears off the scene as quickly as he appeared. The countryside around him dries up. People are suffering, vegetation dying. Where is this man? And then he reappears, encounters Ahab, and says to the king, meet me on the mountain. We're going to have a divine duel for a divided people. And so there on the mountaintop, the rules are laid down. The God who answers by fire, that one will be God. When Elijah prays, a fiery holocaust flashes out of the sky and obliterates the altar and everything on it. And the people fall on their faces in the dirt, crying out, the Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. And then Elijah, having spied a tiny cloud over the Mediterranean, says to Ahab, get in your chariot, for I hear the sound of heavy rain. So pumped up by what has happened on Mount Carmel, he grasps the bridle of the horse in the lead and outruns the king 20 miles to Jezreel through the blinding rain and the swirling wind and dust. What a moment. What a mountain. What a victory. What a purpose. 12 hours later, shaken awake and told Elijah, nothing has changed. The queen's going to kill you. And it sends him into a depression from which we wonder if he will recover. 40 days of flight back to Horeb, Sinai, better known as the mountain of God, where he climbs into a cave, shutting himself off from the outside world, the outside light, human contact, and even God. And it is while he is in that cave that he hears the divine voice with the divine query. What are you doing here, Elijah? You see, there's been a pattern in Elijah's life. And the Lord said, and Elijah went and did. The Lord said, Elijah went and did. But this time, the Lord didn't say, and Elijah still went and did. And God comes and says, what are you doing here? Come out of the cave. What is about to happen is a turning point in the story of God and his people. You see, up to this point, through the work and ministry of people like Moses and Joshua and Elijah, it's been fire and glory and stupendous displays of the divine power that have wowed the people, but haven't necessarily changed them from the heart. And God is going to tell Elijah that's going to shift. It says, Elijah, come out of the cave. And suddenly Elijah hears the whistling of a wind that builds to hurricane gale force, whistling by the mouth of the cave. He knows God can be in the wind. God was in the whirlwind with Job, but God isn't in the wind this time, and Elijah stays in the cave. And then the ground begins to tremble. That deep tremor beneath his feet speaks fear into the heart of anyone who's in a cave. Bouncing around like a ping pong ball, the mountain shakes, rattles, and rolls. And Elijah knows that God can be in the earthquake. It was on this very mountain, when Moses appeared before God, that the mountain shook with the presence of God. But the text says God was not in the earthquake, and Elijah stayed in the cave. And then the stench, the acrid fumes of a sulfuric fire burning, the smoke clogging his nostrils. Did Elijah know God could be in the fire? Wasn't it just 40 days ago that the God who answered by fire would be God? Yes, he can be in the fire. But the text says God wasn't in the fire, and Elijah stayed in the cave. And then came the stillness, the eerie quiet. I've experienced some of that. We've had the privilege on a couple of different occasions of climbing what is believed by some to be Mount Sinai. I can still remember it. Our group got separated, some on camels, some walking, so I found myself climbing the mountain 2:30 in the morning, the Egyptian night, the moon as my only companion. There was a profound stillness. One can almost enter into the sandals and the cloak of Elijah in that cave. And in that profound stillness, the divine whisper, what are you doing here, Elijah? And it is at that point that the sacred narrator says, Elijah wrapped his face in his mantle and came out of the cave to stand in the presence of God. We have to read the words from 1 Kings chapter 19. Verse 9, and the word of the Lord came to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? He replied, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. The Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. After the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice came to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." And the Lord said to him, "Go." This is a turning point in the history of God's people. Because up to this point, God had used might and power, grandeur and glory, shaking mountains, rolling thunder, flashing lightning to announce His presence. And it had wowed the people. They had fallen at times in fear before Him, but it had not led to life and heart change. This is a moment of change because now in the gentle stillness, when the voice speaks, it is as though God is saying, the next time you will see me, I will be a baby weeping, crying in a manger. Because God shifts His way of revelation at this moment. And the crucible is the question. What are you doing here? Elijah answers. He complains. God, they're after you, they're after me. God, I'm the only one you've got left. And God says, get over yourself, Elijah. I got thousands more where you came from. What are you doing here? Are you here in obedience to a divine call? Are you open to the divine purpose that I will place in your life? It's the question that comes to every student. What are you doing here? It's the question that re-echoes years, decades later for every alumni who has watched a career pass moving ever forward in a vehicle called now. And now coming close to the end, the question is still being asked, what am I doing here? Is there anything left? At every point in our lives, that's a key question. And God asks it of Elijah. And He says essentially two things to Elijah. First thing, come out of the cave. Come out of the darkness. Come back into the light. Come back into human contact. Come back into a place where you and I can experience one another's presence, where I can change you, inspire you, Elijah. Come out of the darkness into the light. That's God's call to each of us. Come out and encounter me. Come out of your caves. Be willing. Be open. Come in the morning, come in the evening, but come. That's the first thing God says. The second thing God says is not just come out, but go. Go. He now goes on to tell Elijah, I have a mission for you, a purpose for you. You are not finished. I am not done with you. They may be after you. They may not love me. There may be all kinds of trouble in the land. But Elijah, with you, I am not yet finished. I have a purpose for you that will not be completed until a chariot of fire sweeps you up and we see one another face to face. And that may be where it is for you today. What are you doing here? Student, alumni, church member, friend. It's a question we must answer with better reasons than everybody's got to be somewhere. I'm just going to sneak through here, get out to where real life happens up in Burbank. got to be a better answer than that. And there is. Jesus is not through with you yet. He has something for you. Man was gray in the temples, had spent decades in his work. Were we to hold up his CV today and read through it, we would all say, unbelievable. Remarkable the accomplishments, all that you have done. A lifetime, a career in service to others, to God. But now the man, coming toward the twilight of his career and his life, said, there's nothing left. And slowly he slid into a cave. A family member finally took him to see a therapist. And the therapist said something at that first session. In fact, it was one of the first things the therapist said that became the most memorable statement for this man. They walked in, got acquainted. Therapist said, what brings you here? Well, this, a lifetime, and now, what am I doing here? And the therapist looked at him and said, you have to understand, we never stop serving Christ. Never. So, go.
Thanks for stopping by. I hope and pray that this message was a blessing for you. If you'd like to see more content like this, we need your help. You can support the Keene Seventh Adventist Church Media Ministry by going to AdventistGiving.org, finding the Keene Seventh Adventist Church in Texas, and then putting in your donation to the media line. Your faithful giving and support allows us to spread the gospel online for you and others to participate in. Thank you for your continued support of the Keene Seventh Adventist Church.